Welcome everyone. My name is Divya Pawar and I am a training coordinator at the Temple Small Business Development Center. We help small businesses start and grow, and we're doing this through consulting over the phone or through Zoom and with a robust calendar of training events. Today's webinar is on podcasting for your business 101, development and pre-production. In this webinar, we discuss how to start a broadcast program. This will be presented by Tony Lopes, who is an attorney in the Greater Philadelphia area and a managing partner at Lopes Law LLC. For the webinar, we have all the attendees muted, and we encourage you to put your questions in the chat or Q&A. All the attendees will receive the presentation recording after the webinar. And with that, I'll turn the floor to Tony.
Thank you, Divya. It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you, everyone, for attending. As Divya said, my name is Tony Lopes. I am a practicing attorney at Lopes Law LLC on Instagram. Please follow all three of those brands that you see up there. I am a part of all of those. So Lopes Law is my law firm. CollegeCast Podcast is one of the things that we'll just touch on when we get into my background in a second. And Self-Made Strategies is kind of how I got into podcasting to begin with. That is my podcast that I started a little over 2 years ago to help develop my personal brand, to help me grow my network, to help me place myself as sort of in the center of where my target audience, my target clients were, and that is entrepreneurs. So I'll explain that in a little bit as well. Our format for today is basically going to be going through sort of a 30,000-foot view of what you can expect over the course of the next few sessions. We'll be together for 4 sessions. So we'll talk about the entire journey today. We'll talk about why podcasting is, in my view, such a great tool for you to use in your businesses and how it can help you with your content marketing strategy. Speaking of content marketing strategy, we'll talk about where you can begin, and we'll talk about something called COPE, C-O-P-E, which will help you to leverage your content creation using podcasting so that you don't have to duplicate your efforts and you can save one of your most precious resources, which is time. Then we'll talk about leveraging your content with toolkits, and then we'll start to dive into podcasting. Now, when we get to podcasting, we'll be talking mainly about development and pre-production today, which are your initial steps. So let me just take a quick aside here to say that if you are considering a podcast for your business, I really do think it's a great thing to bring to your business to help with your content strategy, as I said. However, I do want you to go into this with eyes wide open and knowing exactly what you're getting into. As of the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously a lot of people got into podcasting and a new term evolved, and that new term is pod fade. And what that means is that people get into podcasting, they don't realize how much work it's going to be. They go about 7 episodes and then they fade out on average after 7 episodes. So my goal is to help you get past and avoid pod fade. Okay, so I think if you're really strategic and you're really focused on what you're doing when it comes to podcasting, you can create a very good content marketing strategy, a very robust one for your business, but it needs to be strategic. Okay. Now, when I'm looking off to my left here, it's because I'm looking at my screen. I have my camera in front of me, which I'll talk about a little bit when we get into the type of equipment that you might want to consider buying. Now, I'm a bit of a gearhead myself. I don't know about each of you out there. I'm going to give you 3 different options when we get to the production phase of our conversation about podcasts. 3 different options for microphones, 3 different options for cameras, and then 3 different options for mixers. And yes, you do want to get yourself a mixer. Don't worry about this for now. I'll cover a couple of different options that you should consider for that as well. I don't record. I'll say this at the outset. You'll hear me say it again a couple more times, most likely throughout the presentation over the course of the next today's session and the next 3 sessions. And that is, I don't recommend that you record to a computer using software. So forget about your Blue Yeti microphones if you've heard of those and somebody told you that that's the recommendation that you should buy. I'm actually against using Blue Yetis that you plug into your computer using USB or whatever. My philosophy is that most likely you will have some failure at some point when you're recording. And if you talk to people who have been in podcasting long enough, they will tell you that it's not if, it's when. Your software will freeze, your computer will crash, or something will happen and you'll lose that recording. So my recommendation is be strategic and avoid those issues as much as possible. And you can do so on a budget. And as I said, we'll talk about the different grades of equipment. But I do think that you should record to a separate device so that you always have sort of duplicates or backups being built in, so that if one thing fails, you have some backup for yourself to save the day and to save the content that you've acquired. Okay, so a little bit about me rather quickly. As I said, I started my own law firm in 2019, right before the pandemic, and luckily we've been paddling along and have survived through some strategy and through some forward thinking when we first started the firm. Way back at the end of 2018, I think it was in November, December of 2018, I made the decision to start my own podcast. I rattled around in my brain what the name should be, and I came up with the name Self-Made Strategies, which luckily was available as the .com. I bought selfmadestrategies.com, so you can certainly go there and check out my podcast. I have released an episode a week since March 21st of 2019, which was the day that we launched the show. That is, I believe, 138 episodes as of today. They release every Thursday. I have been very, very fortunate, but I'm going to knock on wood that we've been very lucky to get great guests on the show and to have the opportunity to sit down with some really cool people. I've interviewed Tony Luke. Those of you from Philadelphia may know that name. I've interviewed the president of the Philadelphia Union. And I've interviewed some really, really cool people in different areas of nonprofits, artists, entrepreneurs, all sorts of awesome people on my show. And the show has evolved over the 2 years and change that we've been doing it. Again, really, really lucky, have loved doing it. I've produced over 135 episodes, as I said. I think it's 138 as of today. Of the show. It's available on our website, it's available on YouTube, and it's distributed to anywhere else that you can listen to podcasts. And we'll talk about that a little bit as well. Because of that, I was able to start my own production company kind of as a side hustle, which now has evolved into a flourishing production company, Soft Sticks Productions. We've produced 3 seasons of a podcast for a nonprofit organization called Today is a Good Day. You can check them out at todayisagoodday_PA on Instagram or todayisagoodday.org. And if you poke around that site, you'll find the podcasts and you'll see what we've done. Really, really awesome show. That nonprofit helps families with children in the neonatal intensive care unit. So it's been a wonderful project that we've been a part of. And we're now working on 3 additional shows that we're going to be producing over the course of the fall. So very, very busy in that space. And then I was able about a year ago to start a company co-founded with 2 other individuals called CollegeCast. And CollegeCast is an organization where we empower college students to empower their voice by creating their own podcast productions as well. So not to toot my own horn, but I've done this before. I've coached many people now through podcasting. I love it. I think it's a fantastic medium. It's very exciting and could bring some fun and rejuvenate your organization as well. So we'll talk about that. And if anybody has any questions about that, I'm happy to answer that after the show, so to speak. So let's talk about the entire journey, what you're in store for here over the course of the next 4 weeks, counting today. So first and foremost, today, we're going to start on development and pre-production. So let me say this. When you think of podcasts, hopefully some of you have listened to podcasts. If you have not, I highly recommend that you go listen to podcasts, in particular in the space that you're thinking about going into. So let's say, I'll just make up an example. Let's say that you're a florist and you want to start a show that can help grow the content for your business. Well, let me tell you first and foremost that you don't want to start a show about flowers or how great of a florist you are, or the arrangements that you've done, or the clients or projects that you've worked on. We'll get into that a little bit later, but needless to say, your show needs to be developed for your target audience. So if you're a florist and you're trying to attract people that are looking to buy flowers, well, then maybe you want to do a show about gardening tips or how to increase the longevity of the flowers that you buy from the florist or the supermarket or what have you, or maybe about different types of unique flowers or interviews with other people that are in that space. But what you need to do is you need to cater to the target person, individual that you're trying to get to, right? So you really need to spend some time during development thinking about who that person is. And we'll get a little bit more into that a little bit later in today's session. But just kind of want to put that in your mind right now. You need to be providing value at every step of the way, okay? So whoever that person is that you want to bring to your community, and that is what you're doing with a podcast, you're building a community, needs to be someone that you're going to provide value for with each episode. And listen, not every episode is going to be better than the last. Some episodes are going to be absolutely phenomenal, especially if you're interviewing guests. Other episodes maybe are just going to be okay. But you need to always be thinking about that one person that's listening to your show. And you need to be talking to that one person, okay? So basically, you need to think of it as you and your guest, if you're interviewing someone, or you by yourself, are talking to another individual that is this target person that you've conceptualized, and that's who you're trying to cater to, okay? And you can think about this in a variety of different ways. But the most important thing is your why. Why are you doing this, right? What is their why and your why, and how does that sync up? And generally speaking, that turns to values-based thinking, right? So you need to think to yourself, back to our florist example, and I'll switch the examples up a little bit here and there as we go. But in our florist example, you need to think to yourself, who is the target person that would listen to a show about flowers? Well, maybe it's someone who, for instance, throughout the year wants to know about the difference between perennials and other types of flowers, right? Which ones need to be replanted? Which ones will last through the winter if you're up in the Northeast? What about some cool, unique plants that most people don't know about, or flowers that most people don't know about? When's the best time to buy roses versus daisies versus orchids? How do you care for an orchid? All of those things might be turning around in the head of the person who might want to listen to a show like that. So what I might also do is, again, going back, taking a step back to what we were just talking about, is I might go listen to other podcasts or go on Instagram and look at other influencers in that space and see what they're talking about. And then I can develop my show content around that same concept. So that's a good way to kind of compile what values we're talking about. By the way, I cannot recommend enough an old school pencil and pad paper, or a pen and pad of paper, or scratch paper, or however you prefer to do it. And some people do like to work in a digital medium, notes on their phone. For me, I always find it way better if I'm literally writing things down. Sit down with a pad and paper while you're watching Netflix, or while you're hanging out on the couch, or just decompressing after a long day, and just brainstorm. Who is this person and what else do they like? Are they outdoorsy? Do they like to go to restaurants? Do they like to stop at little flower shops, or do they prefer farmers markets? Who is this individual? How much detail can I come up with when I'm thinking about this individual? And it should be values-based. Forget about the demographics for now. Forget about the psychographics for now. Really focus on what interests this person, right? And then after you've got that, and you're kind of already leaning into that delivering what your audience wants concept, you need to tell a story. So we'll talk a little bit about storytelling basics, but depending on how much you want to nerd out about this stuff, you may want to look at videos that talk about good storytelling habits, or the types of books that you might want to read. And I'll make some recommendations as well on that stuff if you want to deep dive into some of this stuff. But I'll give you sort of the cheat sheet that you can use to create your own podcast. Okay. Again, our focus is to make this individual that we're trying to cater to, which may be your target client, may be your target customer, may just be a literal community that you're trying to build because you're interested in doing this. We want to make them the hero in the story that we're telling without being cheesy or salesy. No one listens to a podcast to be sold to. Okay, so don't talk about how great you are. Don't talk about how great your business is. They want to hear how great you are. You need to show them how great that you are, and then they will come. It's like Field of Dreams. You build it, then they come, if you build it for them. Okay, so we're going to create also some copy for advertisers if you're trying to monetize and you're lucky enough to do so. I will say this, right now, the podcasting space is very hot. There's still plenty of room, time, and opportunity to get into podcast advertising. Although I will say that if anyone is sitting here thinking I'm getting into podcasting because I want a piece of the pie and make some money, this is not your path to get rich quick. Okay, so you really need to be building it for this individual, and then other things will come along the way. But it is a useful tool in your marketing strategy for sure for your business. We'll talk a little bit about the legal issues throughout this course associated with copyright, trademark, confidentiality, those kinds of things. We'll talk a little bit about the equipment that you need. Like I said, I'll also tell you what you don't need and how to make working with that equipment easy. Then we'll get into production. Now that's going to happen next week and maybe a little bit of the following week as well, depending on where we get next week. But we'll talk about public speaking and presentation skills, professional presentation while you're delivering on the podcast, what tools you need to have with you, what needs to be scripted, what doesn't need to be scripted, and how you deliver that content eloquently, how you can stay organized so that you always have a safety net and don't get nervous while you're in the middle of a show. Although I will say this, most people you'll experience who get involved in podcasting, there's a little bit of nerves. We all have that naturally at the beginning, but it's a digital medium. Unless you're posting it, and I don't recommend posting it without doing a little bit of editing and polishing on the back end, no one's going to see anything that you don't want them to see. So you record everything. And even to this day, after doing 138 episodes myself, and even after producing around probably another 40 episodes or so myself as well, in general for others, I still make mistakes and I still stumble, or I still have to reread a script line, or may have obviously a few ums and uhs here and there. And that's perfectly natural. That's totally fine. But if you're organized and you take good production notes, which we'll also talk about when we get to production, it'll help you to produce better content on the back end. Okay. Then we'll talk about post-production. Now, in post, what we're talking about is you've finished, you've recorded, you have this content. Now, what do you do with it, right? We'll talk about audio and video editing in a very 30,000 foot, maybe even 50,000 foot view kind of way. I am not in this 1 hour session on week 3, not going to be training you on literally how to edit your own episodes, but I'll point you in the direction of where you can find very robust free software that I use myself and that we use at CollegeCast and at SoftSticks, where you can go to kind of teach yourself if you really want to deep dive into that, or where you can go to find editors. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. But I do recommend some audio and video editing on the back end. Speaking of which, we'll talk today about whether or not you want to do an audio only podcast, which is more traditional, or whether you want to kind of get on this new wave of what we're seeing, which is audio and video for the podcast. And we'll talk about the pros and cons of both of those things, okay? We'll talk a little bit about meeting production deadlines as well, but most likely you're going to be the one setting those deadlines. I do recommend setting deadlines for yourself. that really helped me when I started podcasting way back in March of 2019, because it gave me that extra push once I had 11 episodes recorded to finally go out and start posting those episodes. So we'll talk about that as well, okay? Last but certainly not least, in our final week and in our final session, we'll talk about distribution, which basically is all about how we're going to get this content that we've recorded out to this target audience, right? We'll talk a little bit about where to find them. You'll see that there's lots of varying opinions on that, on how to build an audience to begin with, but we'll also touch a little bit on the technical aspects, RSS feeds, where to go to host it, how to get it set up, all of those things. We'll talk about how to promote it, why you really shouldn't waste a lot of money on paid promotion on social media, especially early on, unless you already have a paid promotion campaign that's working for you, and how to run campaigns. Then we'll talk a little bit about looking at data, although I always caution everyone that's getting into this not to be too bogged down by the numbers, because that's not necessarily what it's about, especially early on, okay? Do we have time to take any questions? Are there any questions at this point?
We have Geraldine here. She has a comment. So she says she's starting a transitional homeless shelter and starting some businesses to give job to the residents. Who would be my target market? I think about people who will donate or volunteer.
Yes. So for nonprofits, what we have found, and we work with a nonprofit, so that's a great question. It really is looking at your donor profiles, right? Your current donor profiles, if you have them. If you don't, it's what I would recommend is, again, going out into, let's say, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Samsung Podcasts, Audible has podcasts now. Going to all of those platforms, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and looking up, just searching for homeless or homelessness, et cetera, food insecurity, those topics that are around that same space that you're looking for, and see what others are doing, see who they're targeting to, and try to figure out who is it that they're targeting to and why. And is there an opportunity for myself to target the same individual? I'll give you an example using our nonprofit that we worked with. By the way, please do go check out the show. Not to toot my own horn, but I'm very proud of what we've done with that project. We're in the middle of releasing season 2. We're up to the last episode of season 2, 10 episodes per season. And season 3 will be released later this year, but that's already all been recorded as of last week. We just wrapped on that. So go see what we did with that podcast and how it's hosted. It's hosted by the executive director of the organization, the leader of the organization, the founder of the organization, and she interviews a variety of collaborative people to talk about topics that are relevant to the NICU audience. Now, in that particular show, they're not necessarily targeting donors as much as they are trying to provide a resource for the families who are undergoing a NICU journey, a neonatal intensive care unit journey. So it's a little bit different because they're trying to create a center of information. In your case, when you're trying to help out individuals who are suffering from homelessness or food insecurity, things in that space, obviously that audience is most likely not going to be listening to it per se. So you may be targeting more so donors. You have to figure out what those donors are interested in values, what draws them to donating to this cause. Is it a family that's undergone some experience with a family member eventually ending up in homelessness? Is it other individuals that are helping for another reason that they want to prevent homelessness? What is the common factor across your donors, and target that? So that would be my advice, is you need to do some research to figure out who your target audience is going to be. Any other questions, Divya?
No.
No, okay. I do see that there's some stuff in the chat. Divya, can you check and see? I think people are asking if there's going to be a PDF. Yes, there will be a copy of this presentation at the end as well. That will be distributed. Sorry. Okay, so let's continue on, and please again throw any questions that you have into the chat or to the Q&A so that we can answer those as we go. Okay, so why podcasting? Well, here's my theory, and other people have other theories. There are other great books out there on podcasting. Certainly, there's one called Make Noise, which is particularly good and talks a little bit about audience building. I highly recommend that book, and you can also listen to it as an audiobook. I have no skin in the game on any of these books, by the way. I'm just passing them on, hopefully that they'll be helpful as well, in addition to this content. And there's also a book called Big Podcast, which is pretty good as well. But Make Noise is a particularly good one. And so in my personal opinion, I think, and I have found in my experience, not only for myself, but working with others, that podcasting is a great multi-tool in your marketing toolkit. Now, I, as an attorney, and then on top of that, being involved in some of these other companies and producing my own podcast, and I've been an adjunct at Temple, not this semester, but I have been the last 3 semesters. So I'm very busy, as I'm sure all of you are. And so I don't have a ton of time to sit down and generate content for social media, for my blog, to build up my website, all of those things, right? But using podcasting, I can sit down and record an interview with an entrepreneur who, by the way, happens to be roughly my target audience, business owners. So I sit down with people who have self-made strategies about how they got to where they are. And we have a discussion about what those strategies were, what their backstory was, what their experience was, how they overcame obstacles in their entrepreneurial journey, so that other potential business owners, entrepreneurs, etc., will end up on my show. And by the way, each guest that I'm interviewing is evolving my network as well, right? Because I'm interviewing my target audience in a way. So by the way, just quick sidebar, going back to the homeless shelter or homelessness nonprofit, you may want to interview some of the donors that you've had, or you may want to do research and find out who the other donors are, right, that are involved in that space, maybe donating to other organizations. So go and ask them why they choose to donate to that organization. And so it's interesting because in each of those sessions, you're building your content for your website, you're building your content for your social media, you're building a podcast, which is all over the place, YouTube content, podcasting channels content. You're giving yourself a tool that allows you access to individuals that you otherwise might not have the opportunity to meet, sit down with, or talk to, who could be potential stakeholders or collaborators for yourself or for your organization. And you're learning more about your target audience at the same time, if you're doing it in that particular way, right? So that's why I think that podcasting in particular is extremely effective, an ultra effective marketing and advertising tool with an ROI, by the way, of over 60% for paid advertising on podcasts. So that's another tool that I can go and say to, for example, a sponsor of a nonprofit organization, hey, you've been sponsoring us for so many years, maybe you sponsor our golf outing. Well, we've just added a podcast to help bring further engagement to the community and to build a community around our organization and brand. We'd love to have you help us by sponsoring the podcast. What do you think? And that provides you with an additional tool now to reach out to them. And again, if you look up the statistics, all things being equal, the ROI on podcast advertising, paid advertising on podcasts, is over 60% year after year and continuing to grow. It's also a wonderful personal branding tool. I don't know about anyone on this webinar, but being a lawyer, every time I'm at a networking event, there's 5 other me's in the room. And every lawyer is talking about how great they are and how their firm is better than the other guy's firm or the other woman's firm, and how they do lawyering better than anybody else. Well, guess what? If I'm in line doing my 30-second pitch going around the room and I'm following up a lawyer or a few other lawyers have gone, nobody's going to remember that lawyer or think to do business with that lawyer, or connect with that lawyer, et cetera. So this is an opportunity to show that you exhibit some level of expertise tangentially, right? Not directly saying, I'm the best lawyer, come listen to this podcast about lawyering, because nobody wants to listen to that. But I can talk about entrepreneurial concepts, and therefore I can show entrepreneurs who are my potential target audience that I have some interest, expertise, influence in that space. Okay, so it's an opportunity to really build out your network in that way. So again, wonderful tool, multifaceted, offers a lot of opportunity. Sorry, this should be 2001. This is 2021. Sorry about that. These statistics are from 2020, and that's why it was 2020. I apologize. But podcasting in 2021 is continuing to grow at an exponential rate. As of 2018, nearly 25% of Americans were listening to podcasts. Right now, it's actually well over 50%. It's increasing dramatically, especially because of the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of people listen to podcasts while they're doing routine tasks, things like now more people are driving again. So driving, doing the dishes, doing laundry, doing household chores, doing things that doesn't require their attention. They listen to podcasts while they're at the gym. It's a means for people to consume content in a much more readily available way. Without getting into all the statistics listed here, which again, you'll get a copy of, the advertising ROI, again, is very, very, very high in podcasting. So it's an attractive tool for your business, okay? So let's talk about the content implementation strategy, because that's the important part, and I want to get to the meat of developing this content. So you have your target audience chosen. We've gotten past what the structure of the show is, which we'll get to in a second. By the way, we're going to kind of bounce around here a little bit. And you know more or less what you want to do with this show. So once you create that content, as I said, once you create that episode and you've edited it, you've polished it, you've got it down to your final version that's going to be distributed, now you can take that piece of content and you've created one thing that you can publish everywhere. So our COPE strategy, which is courtesy of a marketing professional that I had on my podcast way back in episode 4, is create once, publish everywhere. This is not a new strategy, by the way. It's been used in print media for a very, very long amount of time, but we're seeing it again with podcasting, because let me just explain it very clearly. I can record my one podcast episode with a particular guest. I record it, I finish it, I edit it. When I post it to distribute it, which we'll talk about in distribution, it's produced with show notes, which describe, oh, on this episode, you'll hear yada, 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 a little bit about the guest, a backlink to the guest's website. And I post that on my website, selfmadestrategies.com, with those show notes. And I'm always increasing those blog posts on my website. So my website is growing every time I create a new episode. I then have content that I can reach back out to the guest and say, hey, thanks again for being on the show. Here are links to all of the different places you can find the episode, YouTube, my website, etc. And if you don't mind, would you please leave a backlink and post this on your own site? So now you're developing backlinks to your website, which we know is pretty solid for SEO. Now you can also take that content and you can chop it up into bite-sized social media bits that I can use to continue to develop and evolve my Instagram, my Twitter, wherever I live as a brand. I can continue to evolve that by posting it to all of those social media platforms. LinkedIn, all those platforms work well. So I've taken this one piece of content that I've created that's taken me roughly an hour to 2 hours, right? Depending on the length of the episode, the amount of time it takes to edit, and the amount of effort that I have to put in. And now I've chopped it up into different pieces of usable content in different mediums. So it works really well in that context. Okay, Divya, we'll take another quick sidebar for any questions.
Yep. So we have a question. Is podcasting better than YouTube?
So, great question. A couple of things to address there. One, we need to talk about the level of work that you want to put into this content development strategy, right? YouTube videos, believe it or not, take a lot of pre-production, more so than a podcast where I'm interviewing a guest, and I'll tell you why. Let's say that I own a cell phone repair store, and I want to post videos that are going to attract people to me as a center of influence in the cell phone repair space or in the digital device repair space. So if I'm developing a YouTube channel where it's just me talking to the camera so that I can post it to YouTube, it has to be super interesting and really polished. And I have to script it and I have to plan out every episode. Otherwise, it's going to be very sloppy, most likely boring / unwatchable, and not going to do what I want it to do. But if I'm doing a podcast show, my preparation for every episode is simple. I have a guest lined up. So this Thursday, I will give you a live behind the scenes. Here's what's happening in my week this Thursday. I am doing three podcast recordings with 3 different guests, three separate episodes that I'm recording. Each of those, of course, requires a little bit of prep, but my preparation consists of doing a little bit of research about the guest, preparing a bio for them for that episode to read live on the episode, and then 6 to 10 bullet points of questions that I'd like to ask them that I hope my target audience would also be interested in. So my prep for that is a lot easier because I don't have to develop the entirety of the content. I'm bringing people who are just coming on to share their stories and expertise onto my show. So the content development effort is a lot less on the front end, on the development and pre-production side. Additionally, I personally recommend today, 2021, in August, you want to be doing video and audio for your podcast so that you can then distribute to YouTube and develop your YouTube channel with your podcast episodes. So each of my episodes ends up on YouTube as well, in addition to being distributed as a podcast. So I'm kind of double dipping. I'm getting the best of both worlds. I'm creating content, developing a YouTube channel without needing to go through as much pre-production, production, and post-production, et cetera, effort to develop the YouTube content. So that's my personal recommendation. I hope that answered that question. And by the way, at the end of the presentation, and every week I'll hammer this home again, I will leave you with my email address. Please do feel free to email me any questions that we didn't get to, or those of you who are asking questions, if we don't elaborate enough, happy to connect with you and discuss a little bit more on the back end. Any other questions, Divya?
No. Oh, we have one. Just one.
Okay. Yep.
So, do podcast guests need to approve the edited airings?
That is a great question. So, not to get too into the legalese IP side of it, but I did say we touch on this a little bit. You should have a podcast release form for your guests. That release form should be name, image, likeness, and should state in there that at the end of the day, whatever we record is going to be recorded for the purpose of the podcast, and we can do whatever we want with it. Obviously, we tell the guests, every guest, that we're trying to present them in the best light, but you want to be in a position where you don't have to do that, okay? If you don't get that agreement or you don't get their permission, then you're in a position where, you know, you might end up with a guest that says they didn't like the episode, they want you to take it down. You don't want to be in that position. So I recommend getting a release drafted. Shouldn't be too expensive to get one. Get a release drafted, and then from there, have your guests sign that release. Now, I will say that also in my experience, I've only had, I think, 1 or 2 guests maybe say, hey, could you cut this bit out? I didn't like it. And I did that just as a courtesy to the guest. But you don't want to be in a position where you're sending the episode, waiting for their approval. subject and beholden to them saying, I don't like this, I want these changes, I want to re-record this. Don't put yourself in that position. Get a release. And by the way, not to self-solicit, my law firm does do entertainment law. So we do help clients with that as well, but get a release that states, hey, you're going to be on my show. This is an opportunity for you to promote yourself and kind of present yourself as an expert in this space. But we get to do whatever we want with the content that we record, beginning to end, full stop. If we record it, it's ours. We can do what we want with it. Highly recommend doing that rather than putting yourself in harm's way. Any other questions, Divya?
No, and just to mention that the deck will be shared at the end. Okay.
Yes. Okay, great. No problem. Thank you. All right. So again, looking at back to podcast pre-production. So development is what we'll call very early on looking at, that target audience. What do we want to do with them? How are we developing this core topic, right? And it needs to be more than just what are we going to talk about, but also why and how, right? We want to have a lot of why or how questions. People tend to listen to podcasts. This is just my observation. People tend to listen to podcasts because they want to learn something or hear about something or expose to themselves to that form of content and medium. I have a friend who's been producing a podcast for a cheese maker, right? A dairy farm started producing cheese as an additional revenue stream. So they started a podcast, and the podcast is they drink wine, eat some cheese, and they talk about the cheese. That's the podcast. Why? Because they're cheese makers. And so tangentially, the people who are buying cheese for them are cheese connoisseurs, are people that are interested in gourmet cheese, right? Cheese that's produced at this higher level. So again, that's the type of thinking that you want to bring to this, is you want to sit down and think about who are the people that I'm trying to get to, how do I get to them, and how do I create a show that passes the so what test, why should I care test, okay, which we'll get to in a second, just bouncing around a little bit. Another thing you want to think about in development, so this is again, way before we even start to hit that record button, we want to start thinking about these things. And I encourage you over the course of this next week to think about that. If I'm starting a show and I run a business, let's say I'm a restaurateur and I want to attract my target audience. Well, if I'm a Mexican restaurant, again, I don't want to be talking about what a great restaurant I am and the dishes that we serve and all that. Nobody is listening to a podcast for that. What I might want to do is share some great Mexican recipes, or I might want to share how you can make great guacamole at home by yourself, or I might want to interview an agave producer, or I might want to interview a avocado farmer, or something along those lines that, again, is in that space, but it's sort of on the edges of that space. We want to target niche or niche, depending on how you prefer to say it, niche audiences that are in these communities that are related to where we're hovering, right? We don't want to talk about ourselves. We want to attract them. Okay, so we need to also think about our style, our delivery method. I will say, you can develop a show that's a little bit hybrid, but if it's going to be hybrid, then you really need to think strategically. You need to put more care into the development of that show and think about how we're going to bring this all together in a cohesive and non-disruptive way to our target audience, right? We're trying to attract them. We're trying to cater to their ear. So you want to be really careful about either being hyper consistent, which I recommend, or if you're going to do a hybrid style show, meaning by hybrid, I mean 1 week we have an interview, 1 week it's just me talking about some topic, the next week we have a panel discussion, the following week we have a narrated story. That is very all over the place. People like consistency, so give them what they want. If you're going to do an interview show where you're going to interview collaborators, et cetera, that are tangential to stakeholders to your Mexican restaurant, then that show should be an interview show for all 10 episodes of season 1, which, by the way, I highly recommend doing season-based shows where you have 10 episodes per season, okay? Season 1, here's a huge hint that will help you in your endeavors. Season 1 should consist of 11 episodes. We're going to break the mold because you want to do an episode 0 to introduce your show. And that is the one exception where you can break the rule of consistency. So if I were to start all over with self-made strategies, I would highly recommend doing an episode 0, which would be an episode where for 5 to 10 minutes or so, I sit down and I record a session where I say, hey, welcome to Self-Made Strategies. I'm your host, Tony Lopes. This show is going to be the opportunity to sit down with entrepreneurs and hear what makes them tick and a little bit about their personal entrepreneurial journey and what you can learn about it. Notice that I talked to the listener, right? And that I gave them a very quick and concise, what can you expect on this show going forward? So make sure you tune in every week, hit that subscribe button, calls to action, and come back, listen to this show. Season 1 coming soon, coming at you for every Thursday, yada, yada, yada. So script that piece. That's your episode 0. You take that episode 0 and you post it to your RSS feed, which we'll get to later when we get to distribution. And that episode 0 will be your baseline to start your show. Then when you're ready to release and finally officially launch the show, now you're already set up on all your platforms. You've taken care of all the technical difficulties and details that go into getting the show launched. And now you can just launch smoothly when you intended to. So that's my tip of the day and my tip that I hope you'll take with you from this. Start with an episode 0. It'll make your life a lot easier. So after you've chosen your style, you've got your core topic, you know who your target audience is, you've really done all of this thinking. Now you need to think about where, and that goes back to our YouTube question before. It's still totally okay to do an audio only podcast. Totally fine, a lot less post-production headache, a lot less editing, but the trade-off is less work, but you're not going to have as great a content distribution system for later. If you go to YouTube, if you go to Instagram right now, so forgive me, if you go to Instagram right now, what do you see? Reels, TikTok, IGTV, people posting videos in their story, people posting boomerangs. Video is where content is heading. So I highly recommend that although it's a lot more work to produce, and it is, if you produce video and audio, you will still only have one editing process on the back end where you'll edit both at the same time, and you end up with more content that you can then distribute at a highly competitive level, social media, etc. Okay? But I will tell you, the struggle is real. Producing a video and audio podcast is a lot more in depth than an audio only podcast. So you need to decide what your ability to do so is at a high level. I would rather you produce a audio only podcast that is really good than a video and audio podcast that is just okay. Okay. So be really careful about your decisions there. I just want to point to the fact that because we're a little short on time, and maybe we'll come back to this, but in the slides that you'll get, there's a lot more about your podcast pre-production. You have some content production goals here, right? You have tips on sending a show outline to your guest. You'll have the tip on using that original show outline that you're sending to your guest, which is basically, by the way, just the 6 to 10 bulleted questions that we're going to talk about, or topics that we're going to talk about. And I always say, and I cannot emphasize this enough, tell your guests not to script their answers. Podcasting is supposed to be a conversational medium that is more like, kind of like a documentary production, but a little bit less formal, that you can produce that comes very naturally. So you want that natural discussion. You want them to be having a live discussion with you. So you don't want them to script it, but some guests like to be prepared. They want to see the questions. So feel free to send them an outline, 6 to 10 bulleted points, but just tell them not to script it. And same thing goes for you. Don't script anything except for the intro and the outro to the show. Okay. Now, I will say, as I said, we'll touch on where you can get editing resources. A good editor is definitely worth the average cost that you pay for them. Generally speaking, they can be a little pricey, but $60 to $140 per finished half hour of video, of audio, for a good editor. And they are worth it though, because they save you a ton of time in editing. I have actually edited the majority of my 138 episodes. I can tell you from experience that releasing a weekly show and getting that episode edited and out on time every Thursday is a huge mountain to climb on a regular basis. I've had editors here and there that I've used, and sometimes for varying reasons I've taken back over, but it's worth its weight in gold if you have a good editor that must deliver on time. Okay, and usually that editor should send you a first draft for you to check out and say, hey, can you cut this, can you cut that? And they'll do the revisions as part of the editing and kick it back out and help you to distribute it. So they're very, very, very worth their weight in gold for editing, for sure. Okay, I also have some program format tips in here as well. And this is something that you want to think about. So every episode should follow this structure, okay? And that is regardless of the show that you're trying to produce. So at the opening of the show, you have your intro where you say, hey, welcome to the show. On this episode, we've got so-and-so as a guest, or we're going to be talking about yada, yada, yada. The credits to anyone who deserves a credit for that episode, special thank yous, etc. Maybe you throw in a sponsorship or advertiser if you're lucky enough to monetize. But that'll come later, trust me. Then you have your core content elements. You have your program, you know, how long is it going to be? You have your frequency. You have whether or not you're going to do video or audio, like we talked about. Your tone, is this supposed to be funny? Is this supposed to be really professional and polished? Is it serious? Is it true crime? Is it fictional? Is it non-fictional? Then, of course, you have the talent or the hosts. Guess what? That's you. And you need to decide how you're going to structure this. And that's going to be kind of your core content element. And then you have closing elements, which are your outro, meaning, you know, thanks for listening to this episode. Make sure to visit www.selfmadestrategies.com, subscribe to the show, follow us on Instagram, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Your calls to action, special thank yous, yada, yada, yada. And then later in this series, we'll be talking about post-production and distribution, as I said. And in that, we'll cover how you distribute it to YouTube, to your website, to RSS, all of those things, where to go to get your website designed, how to get all of this ready to go. Again, the one thing I will say that if I were you, I would heavily consider is hiring an editor or an organization like ours to help you to post-produce the show at a minimum, because that'll help to get better quality, help to build a bigger following, and help you to distribute it without as many headaches. So thinking about all those things. All right, now back to sort of wrapping up on pre-production and development. So we touched on development. Let's talk a little bit about pre-production in more detail. So one of the things that you want to remember when it comes to pre-producing the show, first and foremost, is there's pre-production of the show itself. So let's say of the overarching show, what it's going to be. Then there's pre-production of each season individually. And then there's a layer of pre-production for each episode on an individual basis. Now, for that, you want to be looking again at your target audience. You want to create taglines and log lines for your show. So a tagline would be something like, everyone here know Fire Festival, seen the documentary or documentaries on Netflix? Well, the tagline for that documentary was Fire, the greatest party that never happened. So your tagline should basically evoke and tell people, this is what it's about. This is what we're talking about, right? And a log line is something that kind of tells the story if you want to create it, not necessarily 100% necessary, but if you want to create a log line, it's basically something along the lines of the story of the hero of your target audience. So basically, it's how does this show cater to that listener that we're trying to get to, right? But the key thing that I want you to remember is that this is a storytelling medium. Do not get guests on your show. It's happened to me, to be honest. Do not get guests on your show to the degree that you possibly can that are just there to sell something. It's very unfortunate. It doesn't generate good content because people listen to podcasts because they want to hear stories. If you go back and listen to the episode that I did with Tony Luke, which is episode 90 something. By the way, that episode I think spans over 2 recordings because it was around 2 hours long because he told great stories. And I just asked him questions and got out of the way, let him tell the stories. And so those are the best episodes to listen to. They're really, really good. They're really fun. You're really getting to know someone. You're really getting to the core of what makes them tick. That's what people want. And it's how the story is told that's the most important. So sharpen your storytelling skills, which this will help. So what you want to do to help is ask the right questions of your guest if you're going to do an interview style show, which, by the way, for anyone here, if you don't know what to do, I would say start with work on developing and brainstorming an interview style show. That's going to be most helpful because, again, you don't have to create all of the content for that show. And so asking the right questions is what's going to lead to the good stories from your guests. Okay. So those types of questions are, generally speaking, how and why questions. Why did you get started as an avocado farmer? How do your avocados differ from other people's avocados? See, there I'm giving them an opportunity to kind of talk about why they're better avocado farmers than somebody else, but we need to bring it back. It can't just be about selling avocados. It's got to be the story at the core of this avocado farmer. That's what people are interested in, okay? And then make sure that you, as the host and the conductor and the talent of this show, are actively listening to what people are saying, because that's how you're going to develop those follow-up questions live while you're recording, so that you can ask more interesting questions and delve deeper into particular topics, okay? And that's the most impactful podcast episodes. And if you go and listen to them, have emotion and explore the emotion that they're uncovering as the story goes, okay? So as promised, and I apologize, we're right up against 6:30. I will stay and hang out for any questions that we have. Happy to hang out for a bit. But here are my 2 email addresses. Soft Sticks Productions is the production company. And if you have questions related to legal topics, please feel free to email us at info@lopeslawllc.com, but you will get a copy of this as well. So Divya, any questions that we have?
Yep. Is Zoom a viable platform to record?
Excellent question. So I will tell you that from my experience, Zoom is both good and terrible at the same time. It facilitates interviews, and I do conduct all of my interviews remotely. I've been doing them all remotely throughout the entirety of the pandemic. I have since switched to Google Meet. I get no money from Zoom or Google Meet. They're not a sponsor or anything like that. This is just my personal experience. I will tell you that on the back end for editing, Zoom creates more problems if you're recording separately, as I recommended, to a recorder and potentially to a camera, which I would recommend. Now, the flip side is, if you're only going to record to Zoom to try to simplify your life and you don't care about quality, now you're breaking the rules I just told you about, then Zoom is fine. If you're going to record a Zoom meeting and then just post that without editing it, that's fine, but very low quality. And I would say that I would recommend not going that route, because the end product is not going to be anything phenomenal. So that's something that we'll talk a little bit more about in post-production and in production. But I would say that it's a useful tool for conducting the interviews and for recording the guest, but it's not a useful tool for recording the entirety of the episode because of the quality. And I would pick Google Meet over Zoom because of less editing headaches. I know that was a wordy answer, but trust me on that one, because I've had many a nightmare because of Zoom. Next question.
I think that's all the questions. While we wait for the questions, I just want to say that I have posted a link to the survey, so please make sure that you fill in the survey. It is required by our funders, the Small Business Administration, so that we can provide no-cost webinars. Okay, I do not see any more questions.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much, Tony.
It's my
Thank you,
pleasure. I
everyone,
look
for
forward to
joining.
seeing everyone next Tuesday. Thanks a lot. Have a great week.
Bye-bye.